Welcome to Candlelight Mysteries, a place where shadows whisper secrets and every flicker of the flame hides a tale untold. Tonight, beneath the glow of a single candle, we will journey into a story filled with suspense, secrets, and timeless intrigue. Before we begin, I'd love to know a little about you. Where are you listening from, and what drew you to the world of mysteries? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's build a circle of mystery lovers together. If you enjoyed tonight's tale, don't forget to subscribe and join our growing Candlelight Mysteries family. Here, every flame carries a story waiting just for you. Now let us step quietly into the darkness and begin. In the heart of an English village where the air smells of roses and fresh-baked seed cake, every whisper carries a story, and every smile hides a secret. At the summer fete of Linton Hall, a single crimson petal drifts into a sugar bowl, and the quiet eyes of Miss Jane Marple begin to see what no one else dares to notice. Behind tea and civility lies a web of deceit, a trembling hand, a forged letter, and a secret steeped in rosehip syrup. This is Miss Marple and the Tragedy of the Crimson Rose, a tale of beauty, betrayal, and the gentle unravelling of truth. Now, pour yourself a cup of tea and listen closely. The roses are about to tell their story. It began, as so many curious things do in St. Mary Mead, with a cup of tea that was just a little too sweet. The summer fete at Linton Hall was the sort of event that seemed to pull the entire village into its orbit. Bunting fluttering from the apple trees, the brass band valiantly out of tune, and Mrs. Hartnell loudly declaring that the sponge entries had been judged in quite the wrong spirit. Amid the hum of chatter and the scent of jam tarts and roses, Miss Jane Marple sat comfortably beneath a striped parasol, her knitting tucked neatly into her reticule, her eyes taking in everything. Mrs. Clarissa Linton, widow of the late Colonel Linton, presided over the proceedings like a queen surveying her domain. Her gown was the soft grey of mourning, but her hat blazed with scarlet roses, an audacious choice, thought Miss Marple mildly, for one who claimed to shun attention. The centrepiece of the flower competition was, of course, the Colonel's famous crimson rose, a hybrid said to be his life's masterpiece. "I declare," whispered Mrs. Price Ridley at Miss Marple's elbow, "that Rose is not half so remarkable as Mrs. Linton thinks it is. Lionel Ash told my husband the colour can be had by ordinary tinting if one knows what one's about." Miss Marple merely smiled, her needles clicking gently. "Tinting, dear? How very modern. But of course, roses, like people, sometimes owe their beauty to a touch of artifice." She watched Mrs. Linton step forward, her hands trembling just enough to rattle the silver pin as she attached the winning ribbon to her bouquet. Such trembling might have been excitement, or age, or something else entirely. Mr. Lionel Ash, the dapper antiques dealer from Much Benham, applauded with courteous enthusiasm.
"Exquisite," he declared. "A bloom fit for a duchess." His eyes, Miss Marple noted,
lingered rather longer on Mrs. Linton than on the flower itself. A short distance away, the gardener Tom Brixham stood with folded arms and an expression that could curdle cream.
"Fit for a duchess, is it?"
he muttered to the cider vendor.
"Aye, and maybe the soil's paid for it too." Miss Marple's sharp ears caught the words, though her gaze remained serenely fixed on her teacup. The soil, she thought. How very curious. The fete swirled on, raffles, children's races, the clink of lemonade glasses, but small oddities seemed to gather like drifting leaves.
When Miss Marple was offered tea by Mrs. Linton herself, she noticed a crimson petal had fallen into the sugar bowl. Mrs. Linton, with a delicate laugh, plucked it out and slipped it into her pocket. "Roses get everywhere," she said lightly. "I think of them as old friends." "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple. "Old friends can sometimes surprise us." As Mrs. Linton turned away, Miss Marple saw a faint, reddish smear on the sugar tongs. Not pollen, she thought, but lacquer, as from paint or polish. The sight made her pause, but only for a moment. She added 1 spoonful of sugar instead of 2, and stirred thoughtfully. Behind her, Mrs. Price Ridley was still gossiping with Mrs. Hartnell. "Mark my words," she whispered. "Mrs. Linton's companion, Miss Vale, won't stay much longer. The poor thing runs errands like a servant. Why, I saw her just now rushing down the lane like the house were afire." "Greta Vale?" Miss Marple asked, glancing up with polite interest. "Yes, that quiet one with the pale hair. Came to help after the Colonel's passing, they say. A gentle soul, but not half as gentle as she looks." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "No one ever is, my dear." The band began to play Greensleeves. The vicar's wife led the children's fancy dress parade, and the afternoon sun gilded the lawn. Yet a small disquiet had settled in Miss Marple's heart. She could not have said why, only that the Fates' laughter rang too brightly, as though to cover something best left unspoken. A few minutes later, Miss Greta Vale returned from her errand, breathless, cheeks flushed, her hat askew. She murmured apologies to Mrs. Linton, who frowned but said nothing. As Miss Greta passed by, Miss Marple's keen eyes took in a detail. A thread from her cuff caught on a rosebush thorn, leaving behind a faint trace of crimson. How strange, thought Miss Marple, that such a quiet woman should look as though she had been running a race. "More tea, Miss Marple?"
asked Mr. Ashe, his smile charming but a little too practised. "Thank you, no," she replied.
"Sweetness quite takes the taste away." He laughed, misunderstanding her entirely.
"Ah, you're right there."
"Life needs a bit of spice, don't you think?" "Indeed," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "though some spices are rather overpowering." Later, as the fete drew to a close, she wandered past the prize table. The roses gleamed like rubies under the tent lights. Yet something in their colour troubled her. The crimson seemed too even, too glossy, as though painted by hand. "Beautiful, aren't they?" said Mrs. Linton's voice behind her, calm now, almost detached. "The Colonel loved them more than anything."
"I sometimes think he bred them for himself. How sentimental," murmured Miss Marple.
"And how fitting. We all leave behind what we care for most, don't we?" Mrs. Linton's lips curved in a faint smile, but her eyes were quite blank as the crowd began to drift toward the raffle draw. Miss Marple lingered near the refreshment tent, her fingers idly adjusting her hat-pin. She overheard the vicar's wife exclaim, "Poor Clarissa! She's not herself since the Colonel died." "There was talk of debts, you know, and of that young man's visits, Mr. Ashe," said another voice. "Oh, I dare say it's only friendship." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but she was thinking of the faint tremor in Mrs. Linton's hands, the crimson stain on the sugar tongs, and the petal pocketed so hastily. The evening shadows lengthened, and the fete wound down. The band packed up, laughter faded to murmurs, and the scent of trampled roses hung heavy in the air. Miss Marple walked home along the lane, her straw hat tipped slightly against the breeze. She passed Tom Brixham's cottage and saw him standing in the doorway, smoking grimly, his face half in shadow. He looked up as she approached. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, not unkindly. "Fine show they made at the hall, eh?" "Very fine," she agreed softly. "Though sometimes, when things are too fine, one wonders what price was paid." He gave a short, humourless laugh. "Price, aye. There's always one." At her cottage gate, Miss Marple paused to sniff a late bloom of her own roses. Their scent was pure and simple, quite unlike the heavy perfume from the hall. She glanced once back down the lane, where the lights of Linton Hall glowed behind the trees like faint red embers. Inside, she set her teacup in the sink, folded her shawl, and looked thoughtfully at the small crimson petal she had picked from her skirt. It was beautiful, but it left a faint trace of dye on her fingertips. "Artificial," she murmured to herself, washing the colour away. How curious that beauty should so often need assistance. Outside, the wind stirred through the hedgerows, carrying with it a single, soft scent of roses, too strong, too cloying, too red, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the first shadow of tragedy. It began with a whisper that landed as lightly as icing sugar on warm seed cake, though it carried a sharper taste beneath the sweetness. The fate had left St. Mary Mead pleasantly weary, yet by the following morning the village had regained its vigour for kindly interest in other people's affairs. Over the clink of cups in the vicarage drawing-room, someone mentioned a small, unfortunate quarrel at Linton Hall, nothing of consequence to be sure, which, as everyone knows, is the opening declaration for something decidedly of consequence. Miss Marple, with her knitting settled like a small grey cat in her lap, listened with the soft alertness of someone who has heard certain notes before and intends to hear them again. "Only a little tiff," the vicar's wife said, trimming the seed cake. China moving about, a raised tone from the morning room. The sort of thing that happens when people are overtired. Mrs. Linton has such nerves at present, poor dear. "Nerves are a very fair explanation for many things," Miss Marple murmured, selecting the smallest slice. "But a raised tone is often a sign that someone is trying not to say something decidedly more serious." Her needles clicked once or twice,
As though punctuation. "Between ourselves," Mrs. Hartnell confided from the settee.
"I am never at ease with a companion who manages the post and the tea tray.
"One or the other, certainly, but both."
It makes a household go queerly. Gossip, as comfortable as a shawl. A domestic note, as faint and telling as a draught under a door. Miss Marple let it warm her hands while she considered what it meant that a quiet companion had an arm in both correspondence and refreshment. Two currents that, if mixed unwisely, could lead to muddle in a household. The weather was clear and rather bright, and Miss Marple, after her visit, took a gentle path through the high street as though her feet, with quite their own minds, knew precisely which errands wished to be done. At the grocer's, where the floorboards creaked politely to announce a customer, she paused as Miss Greta Vale stood at the counter in her neat grey, requesting with a small, composed voice,
"A new bottle of rosehip syrup. Another, Miss Vale?"
said Mr. Pritchard the grocer, surprised into amiability. "Why, I'd have thought the last should see you through a fortnight at least." "The cook has taken a liking for it," Miss Greta replied, the coins bright and exact in her gloved hand. "For the trifles, they look prettier," she says. How curious, thought Miss Marple, who could not recall trifles playing a large part in Linton Hall's customary plain teas. Her gaze drifted, only for a second, toward the companion's little change purse. The clasp was cracked, a hairline split like the first line in a piece of china that will, if mishandled, break clean. Coins pinched just so. The purse held a memory of careful economies. A household's money speaks in the small corners before it raises its voice anywhere else. "Pretty is as pretty does," Miss Marple said mildly, when Miss Greta turned and greeted her. "One mustn't overdress a pudding." Miss Greta smiled with grateful formality, yet somewhere behind her eyes a thread drew taut.
"Quite right."
"But Mrs. Linton has been a little tired. A sweet spoonful helps." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, who remembered a crimson petal in a sugar bowl and the trace of lacquer on tongs, though sweetness should never be mistaken for nourishment. Outside, the lane carried the scent of late roses. Miss Marple paused by the hedge to tie her hat ribbon and felt a soft brush against her sleeve. Something pale fluttered there, a scrap of lawn fabric, the kind one finds in dainty handkerchiefs or collars. It clung as if petitioning to be noticed. She teased it loose and, holding it close for a discreet moment, found that it bore the faintest breath of Turkish attar. Rich, unmistakable, the very scent that had hovered at Linton Hall's doorway yesterday like a guest who does not intend to leave. A clue, if one could call such a gentle, Thing by so impolite a term ought never to be
yanked up like a weed.
It should be observed as one observes a climbing rose, where it begins, where it twines, and which wall it prefers. Miss Marple tucked the scrap into her knitting bag without ceremony. The bag had carried stranger passengers. Across the green, Mr. Lionel Ashe tipped his hat with a flourish that had been rehearsed before a glass. "Miss Marple," he called, "a glorious morning. I have just this minute obtained a locket for a client. Charming thing. Victorian sentimental, though one must always, be careful of provenance." Provenance, Miss Marple agreed, is rather like one's childhood. Handled poorly, it leads to flaws in the most attractive surfaces. Mr. Ashe laughed, a beat too long to be entirely natural. As he raised a hand to polish the locket's rim with his handkerchief, his cuff tugged back a fraction. A little green fibre showed, caught there as persistently as a burr. Garden twine, if Miss Marple was any judge, though she would have said it looked more like Tom Brixham's twine than anything a gentleman might carry. Men do borrow things, of course, and so do women, but a borrowing that leaves traces is another matter. "I am to call at the hall later," Mr. Ashe went on, "to advise on a family trifle, some antique or other which wants a friendly valuation."
Always happy to be of service to a lady in distress. "Oh, let us hope Mrs. Linton is not distressed," Miss Marple said pleasantly, and watched his face for the tiniest flinch.
It came and went like a moth's shadow. By noon, a quick, impertinent little breeze swept down the lane and scattered petals from the hall's front urns, so that red fragments skittered and turned and finally settled against the step as though they were trying to read the doormat. Miss Marple saw Tom Brixham kneel to brush them aside, his large hands surprisingly careful. He glanced up, saw her, and nodded, respectful but rueful. "Good day, Miss Marple. Wind's wrong for the beds," he said. "Wrong for the purse, too, if any ask me. Things run early when they shouldn't, and there's always a cost later." "Early blooms are a vanity," Miss Marple replied, as if discussing knitting wool. "They look very charming for visitors. But the plant remembers." He considered that, and in considering it looked older by 6 months. Aye, the plant remembers. Wish folk did. When she reached Linton Hall, she found the house wearing its daytime politeness. The morning room showed signs of fresh arrangement. One chair near the sideboard where the tea things stood, another angled to permit a view of the gravel path. A person, Miss Marple reflected, grows accustomed to the chair that tells the truth. When a chair is moved, so is the truth. Mrs. Linton entered with a gracious apology for the delay, the faintness of the day before, the tiresomeness of headaches. Her hands were steadier, but too carefully steadied, like a tray held by someone trying not to spill. On her lapel, she had pinned a rose-shaped brooch Miss Marple had not seen the previous afternoon. It caught the light in a manner more eager than tasteful. The pin, Miss Marple noticed as it flashed, was secured with a tiny emergency stitch of dull grey thread. Steady work, not the untidy mending of a hurried maid. Someone who knew stitches had mended it. "Won't you take tea?" Mrs. Linton asked. "Greta, the sugar!" Miss Greta moved at once, yet a fraction too smoothly. She reached for a new jar, too new, and for the spoon, too gleaming. Miss Marple watched the companion's hand hover, and then retreat, as if remembering a lesson learned late at night. The tone in Miss Greta's voice shifted when she said, "Shall I sweeten Mrs. Linton's cup?" A brightness that belonged in a shop, not a sitting-room. "Only one, Greta," Mrs. Linton said, eyes on the window. Miss Marple, who had not been asked, took hers plain. The sugar was not in question, one might say, but the habit around it was. They spoke of parish matters, of the fate receipts, and of the Colonel's roses. Always the roses. Mrs. Linton's manner fluttered and settled and then fluttered again, the way a bird cannot quite decide whether it is safe to land. Miss Marple admired the garden from her chair's angle. She admired, too, the soft ring of something crimson that marked the sideboard's edge, as though a jar or a bottle, its rim touched with colour, had once rested there in a long, careful pause. When Miss Greta poured a second cup, she shifted her weight, and her glove, an admirable, tidy glove, caught the faintest trace of red along its edge. She tucked it away quickly, which was, of course, the very thing that made Miss Marple certain she had seen it. The talk tripped along. The vicar's wife, calling with collection envelopes, stayed just long enough to say, in a voice too bright by half, that she had heard of a letter at the Much Benham solicitors, some tiresome codicil business, nothing to alarm anyone. "I am sure it is all perfectly proper," she concluded, which is the phrase one uses when one is not at all sure. A codicil can be the tidiest way of making a muddle, Miss Marple agreed gently. She watched Mrs. Linton's smile harden at the edges and Miss Greta's attention sharpen with a small, eager light. Later, when the callers had gone, Miss Marple expressed a desire to view the greenhouse. Mrs. Linton hesitated and then conceded with a gracious wave, sending Greta on some errand and deputing Tom Brixham to escort their guest. In the moist warmth of the house, the roses stood like obedient pupils. The thermometer, Tom observed, with a look he tried to keep neutral,
had been tampered with the week before. Nothing serious.
Just a touch, as if to nudge the blooms into beauty before their time. "A touch," Miss Marple said, examining a bloom whose gloss was a fraction too much for nature. "It is the small touches that are often the most eloquent." From the gravel, footsteps, quick, returning. Miss Greta reappeared, breath just slightly uneven, though no errand so humble should demand such haste. Her tone had a nervous sheen when she spoke to Tom, a neatness one would not wear unless one felt observed. "Mrs. Linton has asked for her shawl," she said, as if shawls rarely stay where they should. "Of course," Miss Marple answered for Tom, who was studying his cap as if it had written him a letter. "A draught finds its way in every house." They returned to the morning room. The chairs had shifted again, only by an inch, which is precisely the distance that separates accident from intention. Miss Marple reached for her reticule and, quite by accident, in the way that is not an accident at all, caught a glimpse in the hall mirror. There, a smear of red along the fine edge of Miss Greta's glove. There, too, the set of Mr. Ash's mouth as he came up the path, confident, obliging and just a trifle over-practised. "Mr. Ash, to see you."
"Madam," the housemaid announced, and the air altered as surely as if someone had opened a window and invited in a weather for which the room was not dressed. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once.
Twice a soft and tidy little sound. The breeze outside lifted more petals across the stone and sent them skating under the door. She noticed, as one notices the hinge in a familiar book, that Mrs. Linton's hand went to her brooch, not to greet a friend, but to hold a place. And Miss Greta, hovering with sweetness very precisely measured, kept one eye on the sugar and the other on the visitor. A quarrel muffled by china, a brooch mended by skilled fingers, a companion buying sweet syrup and paying in perfect coin from a purse that had learned restraint, a scrap of scented lawn from a hedge where it did not belong,
a gentleman with garden twine clinging like a secret to his cuff.
In the space between a spoon and a cup, Miss Marple felt the shape of something forming, quietly, domestically, with all the politeness of a drawing-room conversation that has already decided its conclusion. The knock of Mr. Ash's ring against the sideboard gave a small, bright tap, like a bell one hears before the door opens. Miss Marple smiled in her kindly way and folded her knitting, ready to leave as any courteous caller would at the advent of business. Yet, as she rose, her eyes passed once more over the sideboard's faint crimson ring, the new sugar jar, and the spoon laid with rather too much care. Outside, the breeze freshened. Inside, voices arranged themselves like chairs after a visitor comes. And Miss Marple, her smile gentle and her eyes very blue indeed, understood that a sweet thing carelessly offered can hide a bitterness that does not announce itself until it is too late. She reached for her parasol and, with a soft good afternoon, let herself be shown to the door. On the step, a stray petal adhered to the sole of her sensible shoe. She lifted her foot and brushed it away, watching it tumble back over the threshold, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, felt the second shadow of trouble fall across the roses and knew that the next time the tea was poured, it might not be the tea one needed to fear. It was generally agreed in St. Mary Mead that one should never refuse a polite invitation, even when one suspects it to be less an invitation and more a summons. That, at least, was Miss Marple's reasoning when Mrs. Clarissa Linton's neat, cream-coloured note arrived, sealed with an embossed rose and a faint trace of perfume that clung rather longer than good taste required. "Tea at 4 o'clock," the note read. "So many things to talk about." A curious phrase, Miss Marple thought as she placed the letter beside her teacup. So many things could mean anything from jam-making to blackmail, and in St. Mary Mead it had, at times, meant both. When she arrived at Linton Hall that afternoon, the house stood in its usual prim perfection, ivy well trimmed, gravel raked to a faintly menacing neatness. Yet the air around it felt oddly strained, as though the windows themselves were listening. The maid who opened the door was a new one, nervous, young with the uncertain briskness of a person recently warned not to speak unless spoken to. She ushered Miss Marple into the morning room where the tea things gleamed on the sideboard. The arrangement of the furniture caught Miss Marple's eye at once. It was not the arrangement of yesterday. The chintz-covered armchair that usually faced the fireplace had been moved closer to the sideboard, and the smaller chair near the French windows had been turned outward toward the garden. It looked, she thought mildly, like a conversation rearranged, one in which the speaker had wanted a quicker exit or a clearer view. "Miss Marple, how very kind of you to come." Mrs. Linton entered with a soft rustle of silk. Her manner was gracious, even warm, but her face betrayed that faint glazed weariness of someone who had not slept quite enough or quite well. She wore again the grey gown, charming in its simplicity, but now adorned it with a small brooch shaped like a rose. Its pin caught the light in a way that drew the eye, and Miss Marple, who believed in noticing everything once and forgetting nothing until necessary, saw that the clasp was secured by a neat, deliberate stitch of dull grey thread. "Such a tiresome thing," Mrs. Linton said, catching the direction of Miss Marple's glance.
"The catch broke this morning."
"Greta mended it for me. Very tidy work," Miss Marple observed. "I should have thought she'd had professional training in needlework." "Oh, indeed," said Mrs. Linton, a shade too quickly. "Greta is very capable, quite indispensable." At that moment the young companion entered, silent as a shadow, bearing a tray of fresh scones. Her pallor was more marked than usual, and the dark smudge beneath her eyes betrayed either sleeplessness or worry, or both. "Such lovely weather," Miss Marple said cheerfully. "The garden must be flourishing." "It is," Mrs. Linton replied. "Tom Brixham has done wonders with the greenhouse. He's devoted to his work, though perhaps a little
"Obstinate. Devotion and obstinacy often live side by side," Miss Marple smiled.
like neighbours who don't speak but share a hedge." The conversation drifted over safe topics: flowers, the fete proceeds, the vicar's sermon on Sunday. Yet in the pauses between something heavy lingered, like the faint echo of an unspoken word. When Miss Greta poured the tea, she hesitated a moment too long over the sugar jar. Mrs. Linton's hand fluttered up, a silent, habitual gesture, and Greta added 2 spoonfuls instead of 1. "I've opened a new jar," Miss Greta murmured. The others seemed damp. Miss Marple's eyes, mild as a robin's, rested on the jar. Its label was freshly pasted, slightly askew. The sideboard beside it bore a faint ring, a sticky trace with a crimson tint, the same shade as the lacquered petals of the famous rose. "Tea, Miss Marple?" "Thank you, dear." Just as it is, she stirred, her spoon making the lightest of sounds.
Such fine china, she remarked. Is it old?
Mrs. Linton brightened faintly. My husband bought it in London. Staffordshire porcelain, hand-painted. He was particular about his tea things. How wise of him, said Miss Marple.
The little things do make all the difference. There was a small silence, the kind that hums with meaning.
Then Mrs. Linton set down her cup with a clink. You have known me a long while, Miss Marple. You will understand if I say I am tired. Life is not quite as smooth as it once was. Miss Marple looked at her gently. Time changes everything, my dear. Even smooth water becomes rippled when the wind turns. At that, Miss Greta dropped her teaspoon with a sharp clatter. The sound seemed to startle her almost as much as it startled her employer. Greta, my dear, you're quite nervous, Mrs. Linton said sharply. Do sit down. Thank you, madam, I'm quite well. But her tone, though polite, was brittle, like porcelain that will crack if one presses too hard. A distant knock interrupted them. The maid entered with a message from the village, something about a visit from Mr. Ashe later that afternoon regarding valuations. Mr. Ashe? Mrs. Linton repeated faintly.
Oh, yes, of course.
He is advising me on a few things of my husband's, such as the brooch. Miss Marple asked, smiling pleasantly. Mrs. Linton blinked. The brooch?
Oh, no, nothing like that.
Just papers. Family papers. Her gaze shifted toward Greta, who had paled even further. Miss Marple let the subject drift as if she had asked purely out of idle curiosity. But her eyes wandered once more to the brooch, the careful mending, the faint shimmer of polish along one petal that did not quite match the rest. A clock ticked. Outside, a faint breeze stirred the roses. The air felt close. At last, Miss Marple rose. You must forgive me, my dear Mrs. Linton. I promised the vicar's wife I would stop by to admire her hollyhocks before supper. Of course, Miss Marple.
You're always so busy. Not busy, only
attentive, said Miss Marple softly. As she passed into the hall, she paused before the mirror to adjust her hat. There, reflected neatly, she saw Miss Greta's gloved hand resting on the edge of the table, one glove smudged faintly with red polish. And when Greta noticed the reflection, she snatched the glove away, slipping it quickly into her pocket. Miss Marple's expression did not change. She simply smiled, thanked the maid for her trouble, and stepped outside into the mild air. The roses along the drive glowed with unnatural brilliance, as though someone had coaxed the season forward by will alone. She stooped to examine one, its petals soft, glossy, and oddly scentless. The greenhouse stood beyond, its glass panes winking in the sun. Inside she could just make out Tom Brixham's solid shape, bent over a pot. He looked up as she passed and gave her a slow nod. Strange weather for roses, Miss Marple. Too quick a heat makes them bloom before they're ready. They don't last. No, said Miss Marple gently. Things forced before their time rarely do. That evening, as she sat by her window knitting, the faintest perfume of roses drifted in from the garden, heady, cloying, too sweet by half. She thought again of Mrs. Linton's trembling hand, the crimson ring on the sideboard, the new sugar jar, and the polished brooch mended by a companion who bought rosehip syrup in exact measure. Far away, the clock at Linton Hall struck 6, the sound carrying across the fields like a reminder of something unfinished. Miss Marple laid down her knitting. The wool had tangled slightly, one thread knotted just where it shouldn't. She smoothed it with a patient smile. There's always a knot somewhere, she murmured, if one just looks closely enough. Outside, a single rose petal, dark and shining, tumbled from her window box and came to rest on the sill, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the third shadow of tragedy. It was on a bright Thursday morning, clear and brisk, When Miss Marple decided that a little trip to Much Benham would do her roses and her curiosity a world of good, she had, after all, an errand to post a letter, though it was the sort of errand one could accomplish without leaving the village. Still, one never knows what one may overhear in a solicitor's office, especially when one listens as quietly as she did. The train ride was pleasant. Miss Marple sat opposite a stout lady with a basket of eggs and a hat that quivered dangerously each time the carriage rattled. They spoke, of course, of the fete and of Mrs. Linton's magnificent roses, though the stout lady lowered her voice to add, "They say she's to have the place in her name now. Something to do with the papers." "Papers," Miss Marple repeated with mild astonishment.
At her age? How ambitious. Oh, not like that, my dear, the lady whispered conspiratorially. A codicil, they're calling it. To the Colonel's will.
"I heard it from my cousin's boy. He's a clerk at Hargreaves and Bentham, the solicitors. Seems it's all been signed or about to be." "There's talk of the gardens changing hands," Miss Marple smiled politely, though her mind began to move with the gentle, unhurried rhythm of knitting needles. Gardens, codicils, and companions, 3 words that rarely occupied the same sentence without producing trouble. When she reached the offices of Hargreaves and Bentham, the bell over the door tinkled with such timid modesty that it almost excused the dust on the counter. The young clerk, a nervous fellow with hair that refused to stay parted, blinked up at her. "I was hoping to make a small inquiry," Miss Marple said with a sweet, unthreatening smile. "Our vicarage bazaar is in need of a donors list, and I recall that Mrs. Linton has been most generous in past years. Would you happen to know whether her usual contribution was confirmed?" "Oh, Mrs. Linton," the clerk said, straightening a pile of papers already perfectly straight.
Yes, madam, she's been in correspondence lately.
"Strictly private, of course." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed, her voice soothing as warm milk. So kind of her to manage such things herself. The Colonel always handled that side, didn't he? The clerk hesitated, and hesitation, Miss Marple knew, is merely truth trying to hold its breath.
I believe there was some difficulty, madam.
The Colonel left clear instructions, but there's been an
addition. A codicil?
She asked gently, as if guessing a nursery rhyme. He looked startled. "Yes, how did you—" "Well, a letter was sent last month to confirm its existence."
Odd handwriting, though. Perfectly legible, but how shall I put it? Too neat. More like tracing than writing.
"We thought nothing of it, of course." Miss Marple made a small, sympathetic sound. "One shouldn't think ill of tidy people, my dear. Still, I do wonder if neatness might sometimes conceal rather a lot." As he turned away to fetch something from the file cabinet, she allowed her eyes to wander over the desk. The blotter, slightly askew, bore mirror imprints from the last few letters written upon it. In tidy copperplate, she could make out the faint words "rosehip," and, beneath it, a series of figures arranged like a recipe. 1 to 4, 4 to 8. Miss Marple's lips moved in silent repetition. 1 to 4.
4 to 8.
Proportions, perhaps. A recipe, though not one for trifles, she thought. When the clerk returned, she thanked him warmly, tucked her gloves under her arm, and departed with the serene air of one who had learned nothing at all. Outside, Much Benham's cobbled street shimmered in sunlight. Miss Marple took her time at the haberdasher's, buying a new ribbon for her sun hat. As she paid, her eye caught a familiar figure across the way, Miss Greta Vale, her grey suit impeccable as ever, purchasing crimson ribbon from the same shop in the opposite window. "For hymn books," Miss Greta was saying to the shop girl, her tone too light, her smile too stiff. "Mrs. Linton insists on red for the altar bows." "Red," murmured Miss Marple softly to herself. "Always red." She lingered long enough to see Miss Greta leave, a small brown parcel in hand, and follow her brisk steps toward the railway station. It was odd, Miss Marple reflected, that a companion's errands always seemed to coincide with her employer's most delicate affairs. Back in St. Mary Mead, the gossip was in full bloom, as gossip always is when the weather is fine. At the post office, Mrs. Price Ridley declared that Mr. Lionel Ashe had been seen in earnest conversation with Tom Brixham by the churchyard gate. "And when two men speak earnestly in that manner," she said, lowering her voice as if announcing a death, "it's either money or mischief," Miss Marple, sorting her postcards, replied mildly. "The two subjects are not always distinct, my dear." Later that afternoon, while trimming her geraniums, she saw Mr. Ashe himself strolling along the lane, his manner relaxed, his smile just a little too well polished. He raised his hat. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. You'll be glad to know I've settled matters at the Hall. A valuation or two, a bit of friendly advice, that sort of thing." "How very obliging of you," Miss Marple said.
"I hope Mrs. Linton was pleased." "Oh, yes," he said lightly.
"She's a gracious lady, quite trusting," Miss Marple nodded, as though such trust were the most ordinary and harmless thing in the world.
"And Mr. Brixham?"
"He's fond of the gardens, I understand." Mr. Ashe's smile thinned.
"Ah, the gardener. A good fellow, if a touch too independent."
"Doesn't care much for others meddling in his work." "No," said Miss Marple. "Gardeners rarely do." As he walked on, she noticed his gloved hand brushing against the low hedge. His fingers came away flecked with fine green powder. Fertilizer dust, perhaps, or something stranger. That evening, Miss Marple took her customary stroll toward the Hall. The air smelled of damp earth and rose leaves. Through the trees she could see the greenhouse lit from within, a dim lantern glow surrounded by shadow. Tom Brixham moved among the rows, his shoulders heavy. A faint clang came from within, a dropped tool. And then silence. She lingered by the gate just long enough to see Miss Greta's figure appear at the side door, a shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders despite the mild air. She turned the key in the lock with care and disappeared inside. By the time Miss Marple reached home, the first drops of rain had begun to fall. She set her umbrella by the hearth and laid her gloves on the table. From the pocket of her cardigan she withdrew a small scrap of paper, the blotter's faint impression she had sketched in pencil. Rosehip, 1 to 4, 4 to 8. It was not, she thought, an ordinary ratio for syrup or cordial, but it might do very well for something else entirely. Later, as the rain pattered against the window panes, Miss Marple poured herself a modest cup of cocoa and sat in her armchair. She replayed the day's small symphony of clues, a codicil traced in too neat handwriting, a companion purchasing crimson ribbon and rosehip syrup, a gentleman with green twine on his cuff, and a gardener muttering about changes to the garden. Each by itself was nothing, small domestic details, the sort of thing anyone might overlook. Yet together they hummed a tune she recognized, low and dangerous beneath the ordinary melody of village life. The clock struck 9. Miss Marple rose, drew the curtains, and murmured to herself, "A codicil is a delicate thing. One must be very sure whose hand writes the final flourish." Outside the rain deepened, washing the roses clean for another day. But somewhere beyond the vicarage lane, another scent drifted faintly through the damp air, sweet, heavy, and cloying, like syrup warmed too long, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the fourth shadow of tragedy. It is an uncommonly sharp mind. Miss Marple often reflected that hides itself in the plainness of a teacup. The trick, of course, is to look for what floats to the surface. That morning, St. Mary Mead glistened after the night's rain. The hedgerows sparkled as though dusted with sugar, and the air smelled faintly of wet roses and something else, something too sweet, almost syrupy. In her little parlour, Miss Marple sat by the window with a teapot, a magnifying glass, and 2 small saucers. To the untrained eye, she appeared to be preparing for breakfast. To anyone who knew her better, it was clear she was conducting an experiment. On one saucer, she poured a measure of rosehip syrup. On the other, she placed a spoonful of loose tea leaves and sprinkled them with the same syrup. Within moments, the leaves darkened, releasing an aroma that was not quite pleasant. Miss Marple stirred, observed, and murmured softly, "Ah, It hides the bitterness entirely. She smiled, poured the concoction down the sink and rinsed the saucer twice. Then, as any good lady of the parish would do, she wrapped up her shawl and set out to call on the vicar's wife, ostensibly to return a borrowed hymnal, but in truth to see how far news had travelled. "Terrible thing," the vicar's wife said as she welcomed her in. "Miss Linton nearly swooned right in the middle of choir practice yesterday. Quite a scene, poor dear. Miss Vale handled it all, naturally. Wouldn't hear of calling the doctor. Said it was only a draught from the vestry window." "How fortunate," Miss Marple said, removing her gloves. "The vestry is famous for its draughts. Still, it is unwise to faint in a place of worship. It tends to become public property within the hour." The vicar's wife chuckled guiltily. "Oh, my dear Miss Marple, you do have the way of putting things." Of course, there was talk. One or two ladies suggested Mrs. Linton might be under strain. "You know how gossip thrives where sympathy should stand?" "I do," said Miss Marple gently. "But gossip is rather like ivy. It tells you what it clings to." As she spoke, her gaze rested on the open choir ledger lying on the hall table. The names were neatly entered, as always, in Miss Greta Vale's careful hand. But one entry caught her eye. Mrs. Price Ridley, marked present. Miss Marple distinctly remembered the woman boasting only yesterday of her trip to Bath that same day. Curious, she thought.
Very curious. She ran a finger along the margin as if admiring the penmanship.
"How diligent Miss Vale is with her records," she murmured. "Oh, quite," said the vicar's wife, without noticing the gentle irony. "Such neatness, though it does make one nervous. Nothing untidy ever escapes her attention." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "It seems Miss Vale prefers her truths as she prefers her ribbons, straight and symmetrical." From there, she made her way to the High Street, where Mr. Lionel Ashe stood outside his antiques shop, polishing a glass case that gleamed with suggestive importance. He greeted her with the manner of a man eager to charm. "Miss Marple, you always brighten the day. Do come in. Perhaps a small treasure might catch your eye." "Something sentimental?" "Sentiment, Mr. Ashe," she said, "is best kept in letters, not in lockets." "Ah, but speaking of lockets..." He reached into the display and produced a delicate gold oval on a fine chain. Inside, under the glass, was a single pressed crimson petal and a folded scrap of paper marked with initials. "CL." Miss Marple tilted her head.
"Colonel Linton's? Or Clarissa's?"
He looked momentarily caught, then smiled with his professional ease. "Found it among a tray of curiosities. Likely nothing at all, though the initials do lend it charm. A reminder of love, perhaps." "Or of property," said Miss Marple quietly. "One so often confuses the two." She turned the locket in her hand just long enough to see a small flake of red polish clinging to the hinge. She returned it with a kind smile. How lovely that some memories never fade. When she left, he was still watching her with that polite,
uncertain smile, the smile of a man who doesn't yet know what he's being suspected of. At the corner of the green,
she stopped at the grocer's. Tom Brixham was there, leaning on the counter, his cap in hand, his expression dark as overripe soil. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, not looking up. "Weather's been queer."
"Roses forcing themselves early, as if something's been meddling in the house." "In the house?" "Aye," he muttered.
"Thermometer was moved in the greenhouse. Temperature up by 5 degrees. I set it right, but someone keeps changing it again."
"Not me, not the boy."
"And Mrs. Linton, she don't step foot inside since the Colonel passed. Perhaps Miss Vale?" Miss Marple suggested mildly. "Maybe," he said, frowning. "Though she's got no business with blooms, always at her papers and errands. Still, she's been up early these last mornings, earlier than me sometimes." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And roses that bloom before their time are such restless things. They never last." By late afternoon, the air thickened with the scent of overripe flowers. She saw a cart rattle up toward Linton Hall, bearing crates of glass and silverware for a special supper. Villagers whispered that Mrs. Linton was entertaining again. Small company, just close friends, though close friends in such circles often meant potential trouble. Miss Marple spent that evening quietly at home, reviewing her notes. The details were all so tidy, so domestic. A fainting fit at choir,
A forged attendance.
a locket bearing the wrong initials,
A gardener's complaint.
and everywhere roses, syrup, and sweetness masking bitterness. She poured herself a cup of tea, adding only a drop of lemon. Sweetness, she reflected, was best in moderation. It disguised too much otherwise. Her gaze fell to her knitting basket, where a scrap of fabric still rested, the pale lawn she had found by the hedge days before. She lifted it, inhaled faintly, and recognized the same cloying attar scent from the rosehip syrup. The clock ticked softly, marking the rhythm of her thoughts. She could almost see the picture forming now, though the edges were still blurred. Someone was preparing something at the hall, something that required care, secrecy, and a precise hand. Someone who knew about syrups and stitches, about codicils and comfort. Someone whose neatness could mask cruelty as easily as embroidery masks a patch, and yet there was something still missing. The reason behind it all, the motive, lay hidden. Like the bitter kernel beneath sugared almonds, the next day, she resolved, she would accept the inevitable, a small dinner at Linton Hall, to which she would, no doubt, be invited in the name of friendship. She would go, of course, for where tea is poured and sugar stirred, truth often dissolves a little too easily. She set her cup down, folded her hands, and looked out at the evening garden. Her own roses. Cup of tea, and murmured, "Crimson again." How persistent a colour can be when it means to be noticed. By 7:30, the lamps were lit along the drive of Linton Hall, throwing pools of golden light over the gravel. The house looked serene, too serene perhaps, like a stage set waiting for the curtain to rise. Miss Marple arrived in her best grey shawl, sensible shoes polished to discretion, and knitting needles tucked in her reticule, though she had no intention of using them tonight. Inside, the air smelled faintly of roses and something warmer. Wine, perhaps, or polish. Mrs. Linton greeted her with the fragile brightness of a woman performing hospitality by will alone. Her gown was of pale, dove-grey silk, and at her throat, gleaming as always, rested the rose-shaped brooch, newly polished and fastened with its telltale mended clasp. "Miss Marple, how kind of you," she said. "We're just gathering in the morning room before dinner. I do so hope you'll enjoy a quiet evening after all the bustle of the fete." "Quiet evenings," said Miss Marple, "are often the ones one remembers best." Mr. Lionel Ashe was already there, glass in hand, looking too at home for someone who wasn't. His charm filled the space between sentences like a practiced melody. Beside him, Miss Greta Vale moved about with silent efficiency, attending to small details that no hostess should have to notice, the placing of napkins, the lighting of candles, the clearing of invisible dust. Tom Brixham. The gardener appeared awkward in a borrowed suit, standing by the door like a man uncertain of his invitation but unwilling to refuse it. His large hands twisted his hat nervously until Mrs. Linton urged him to relax. "Just us this evening," she said lightly. "A family of sorts." Miss Marple, seated by the sideboard, observed that the phrase made the companion flinch, barely but noticeably. Dinner was announced. The table gleamed with crystal and silver, a small masterpiece of arrangement. The crimson ribbon from the invitation now appeared at each setting, tied neatly round the white napkins.
A charming touch, thought Miss Marple, but the charm seemed deliberate.
Even rehearsed. The conversation began harmlessly enough. Talk of parish bazaars, of the vicar's interminable sermon, of the weather and its effect on roses. But beneath it, Miss Marple felt the faint tremor of nerves, Mrs. Linton's too careful laughter, Greta's watchful silences, Mr. Ashe's overbright charm. The soup was served. Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Linton's cup of tea, oddly, had been brought in advance by Miss Greta herself. The companion stirred it with delicate precision, then placed it by her mistress's plate before sitting down. When the main course arrived, a small incident occurred, small but enough to shift the air. Mr. Ashe reached for the decanter of wine. "Allow me," he said, smiling, and poured with a flourish. Yet Miss Marple's sharp eyes noticed something peculiar. The label on the decanter was different from the one she had seen at the fete. It bore the same monogram, yes, but the tiny nick at its edge was gone. A replacement, she thought, and hurriedly made. "Delightful vintage," Ashe declared. "Colonel Linton had fine taste." "Yes," said Mrs. Linton faintly. "He did." She sipped, then shivered, as if at a sudden draught. The clock on the mantel struck 9. Outside, a breeze stirred the trees, making the candle flames dance. Tom Brixham, silent all evening, leaned forward slightly, his heavy brow creased. "Beg pardon, ma'am," he said in a low voice, "but the greenhouse key, it's gone missing again. I locked it up myself yesterday." Mrs. Linton's hand trembled slightly on her teacup.
"It doesn't matter, Tom. Please, let's not discuss work tonight." "Of course, ma'am," he muttered, withdrawing.
Yet the look he cast toward Miss Greta was not a friendly one. Conversation resumed, but it was thinner now. Miss Marple kept her gaze mild, her hands folded over her knitting bag. She did not miss the way Miss Greta's fingers lingered on the sugar spoon when she refilled Mrs. Linton's cup, nor the way the companion's eyes darted, just once, toward the sideboard drawer. "There, where the tea jars were kept. Tell us a story, Mr. Ashe," said Mrs. Linton suddenly, as if to fill the silence. "Something from your travels." He obliged at once, of course he did, with a tale about a lost heirloom and a mistaken identity in Vienna. His laughter rang pleasantly, but Miss Marple heard the faint scratch of his signet ring against the glass each time he gestured. A nervous tic, perhaps, or something less innocent? She sipped her tea and murmured, "Lost heirlooms are very sad things. They have a way of finding themselves again, often in the most unexpected hands." Mr. Ashe faltered for half a second, then recovered. "Quite so, Miss Marple. One must never underestimate the past's talent for returning." A gust of wind pressed against the French doors. The candle nearest Miss Greta flickered, guttered, then flared up again. And in that brief, wavering light, Miss Marple saw it, the faint shimmer of red polish on the rim of Mrs. Linton's spoon. She set down her cup quietly. "How beautiful the roses look by candlelight," she said softly, almost as though they were alive. Mrs. Linton looked up sharply. "Roses? From your garden, my dear. Such a striking hue. I'm afraid my own have lost their bloom entirely." There was a pause, small, delicate, but sharp enough to draw blood. Then Miss Greta rose, smiling with perfect composure.
"I'll fetch more sugar," she said. "No, Greta," said Mrs. Linton quickly.
"Sit down." For a moment, the two women looked at each other, mistress and companion, hand and shadow. Then Miss Greta sat, her knuckles white on the tablecloth. Miss Marple, ever gentle, broke the silence. "You must forgive an old woman's curiosity," she said kindly. "I was admiring the way you tied the ribbons on the napkins. Such precision. They all match exactly, except—" She lifted her own, lightly. "Except this one, which is ever so slightly darker. A different dye, perhaps." The companion's face went still.
"Oh," she said lightly, "how odd. I must have mixed them by mistake." "Easily done," said Miss Marple, smiling.
"Though I suppose one ribbon might have had a special purpose." A long, soft tick of the clock followed. Then, somewhere deep in the house, a door creaked shut. 10 o'clock chimed. Mr. Ashe rose to make his farewell, but Mrs. Linton stopped him. "Please, stay a while longer. The evening is young." Tom Brixham stood too, muttering something about checking the lamps in the greenhouse. Mrs. Linton's hand shot out suddenly. "No, Tom, leave them, please." Her tone was sharper now, more urgent. Miss Marple folded her napkin carefully, the crimson ribbon coiled like a thread of warning on her palm. Her voice, when she spoke, was gentle as ever. "You're all very kind," she said.
"But I do believe I'll be off."
"It's nearly my bedtime, and I'd rather not walk home by moonlight." "Greta," Mrs. Linton said quickly, "fetch her wrap." As Miss Marple waited, she glanced toward the decanter. A faint ring of sticky residue glimmered on the cloth beneath it, crimson, not from wine.
Something lacquered.
Something familiar. When Miss Greta returned, her composure was perfect once more. Yet, as she held out the shawl, the faint scent of rosehip clung to the fabric, heavy, unmistakable. Miss Marple smiled and thanked her, her tone as light as if she had noticed nothing at all. But as she stepped outside into the cool night, the air seemed to breathe around her, carrying the faintest whisper of roses and varnish. Inside, behind closed doors, the candles flickered again, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the sixth shadow of tragedy. It began with curtains drawn to the hearth. Neither day nor night, but a hush that felt arranged. St. Mary Mead woke softly, as if the village had been asked to keep its voice down. Milk carts rattled past Linton Hall without their usual chatter, and the postboy turned away at the gate twice before being admitted. It was the sort of morning that asks for calm and insists upon secrecy. Miss Marple, standing by her own garden with a basket for the roses, thought the air smelled less of dew and more of something sweetened and stale, like tea left out overnight. At Linton Hall, the bell answered with a subdued echo. The new maid, eyes large, hands uncertain, showed Miss Marple into the morning room, then hesitated as though she had forgotten the rest of her instructions and was trying to remember them in the right order.
"Miss Vale will be with you," she whispered, and fled.
Miss Greta Vale arrived almost at once, composed but pale, her neat grey seeming greyer. "Mrs. Linton is resting deeply," she said, in a voice gently placed on its best behaviour. "She begged to be spared callers." "Dear me," murmured Miss Marple. "Rest is best prescribed when one can be quite certain it refreshes." She set her gloves on the table and noticed, as any tidy soul would, the faint smear of red on the edge of a doily wiped at, not removed. Miss Greta poured tea with the calm of a chapel service. "Mr. Ashe had urgent business in town," she continued. "He left very early."
"I believe he will write down,"
said Miss Marple mildly.
"So brisk of him."
"The lanes do offer challenges after rain." "Not to Mr. Ashe," said Greta, smiling a fraction too promptly. "He is resourceful." A gossip thread tugged at the window from the gravel sweep outside. Miss Marple observed the bicycle leaning just within the side gate, the tyres mottled with meadow mud, the sort one gets from the field path rather than the road. "Resourceful indeed," she said, and took her tea without sugar. The room was neat, of course. Things were always neat where Miss Greta arranged them. And yet a neat room can be full of noise if one keeps the right sort of silence. Miss Marple stood as though admiring a little watercolour over the mantel, and let her eye fall to the hearth.
Ash lay there in a feathery crescent, the kind that follows a hasty fire lit to remove a chill or a memory. "Such a lovely morning," Miss Marple said, just to say something that contained nothing.
She lifted the little hearth brush to straighten what had not asked to be straightened, and, with the gentlest of touches, parted ash from ash. A thin curl of paper showed fragile as mothwing. She teased it free. On it, the top of a letterhead, Hargreaves and Bentham Solicitors. Pressed, within the ash fold, a petal, crimson, quite intact, as if even fire hesitated to disturb what had been arranged with such care. "How curious," said Miss Marple, as though finding old correspondence in a hearth were the sort of thing that happened daily between biscuits. Miss Greta's tone thinned almost imperceptibly. "The maid is careless," she said.
"I find it maddening." "Carelessness," observed Miss Marple, "is very different from haste." The clock in the hall chimed a discreet quarter.
Tom Brixham appeared in the doorway, cap in hand, shoulders too big for the frame. "Beg pardon, Miss Vale. I'll just see to the greenhouse," he said, in the voice of a man who wished to be invisible and was too solid for the attempt. He blinked when he noticed Miss Marple and gave her a grave nod. "Ma'am, how is your thermometer this morning, Tom?" Miss Marple asked pleasantly. "Set right," he said, with a stubborn dignity that always sounds like a confession to those who have not earned it. "Stayed right since last night. And I never touch the sugar jars, if that's what's being said." "No one implied as much," said Miss Greta, a trifle too quickly. Her tone had the glint that tidy people keep for stubborn facts. Tom's jaw moved.
"I put one chair back, that's all," he muttered.
Things aren't where they ought to be sometimes. Chairs, Miss Marple knew, tell the truth of a room when words decline too. She turned a fraction and saw it. The smaller chair angled again toward the garden path by an inch or two. The difference between a habit and a plan is often measured in inches. From the pantry there came the quiet clink of crockery. Miss Marple, with a little apology no one objected to, strolled to the threshold and peeped in. The housemaid stood rigid at the sink, scrubbing a spoon with the fervour of repentance, though the bowl still held neat beads of water, as if the washing had been half-hearted, hurried.
A scent hovered, roses with something medicinal smuggled in beneath. "Take care, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly.
There is nothing so dangerous as a spotless conscience in a hurry. In the morning room again, she set her teacup down and admired the light on the roses outside, which surely did not need admiration, being quite satisfied with themselves. "Mr. Ashe will have taken the road past Holman's meadow," she remarked, more to the air than to Greta. "A pity about the mud." "I wouldn't know," said Greta, her smile neat as a stitch. But her eyes slipped once toward the side gate, where the bicycle leaned as it had leaned a half-hour before, and that was an answer of its own. A church bell began its sober peal. Practice, perhaps, or simply the parish reminding itself of time's steady passage. Gossip travels best on bell notes, and the faintest drift of it arrived with the postmistress, all apologies and envelopes.
"Terrible to disturb," she said, sliding a small stack onto the sideboard and not looking at the hearth.
"Only there was talk down the lane. Mr. Ashe went out before dawn, and the baker swears he saw him by Miller's Pond instead." "How confusing for the pond," Miss Marple murmured. "One so rarely has the opportunity to be both meadow and water on the same morning." Greta dismissed it with a shake of the head, but her grip on the edge of the tray tightened until the blood left the knuckles. It is always loud when blood leaves a place. Miss Marple wandered the room with the absent-mindedness of a forgetful aunt. Her eyes touched the sideboard, its cloth faintly marked with a ring of crimson, no larger than a sovereign. Yesterday's mark, she thought, or the day before's. It is astonishing what lingers when one believes one has wiped everything away. "Would you like more tea?" asked Greta. Her voice had acquired the cheerful lift the people employ when they are certain that cheerfulness alone can arrange the truth. "No, thank you," Miss Marple said.
"I prefer the flavour as it is," she added after a gentle beat. "Some tastes are improved by sweetness, of course."
"Others are not changed by it at all. One can draw very useful conclusions if one watches which is which." Greta's smile held. "You always do, Miss Marple." "Not always," Miss Marple said. "Only more often than is comfortable." Tom Brixham came back from the garden with the careful tread of a man, trying not to carry in mud and bringing in weather instead.
"Lamp set," he said.
"Keys where they belong." Then to Miss Marple, lower. "I've not said a word about jars."
"Nor about the chair."
"But if you ask me, a spoon doesn't wash itself." "Quite," Miss Marple agreed. "And a petal does not throw itself into a hearth either." Greta's cup touched the saucer too sharply.
Really, Miss Marple, if you mean to accuse.
Miss Marple's brows lifted as lightly as dandelion fluff.
Oh no, I dislike accusations.
They are so rarely as productive as observations. For instance, I observe that Mrs. Linton's brooch is not on the hall table where it usually rests at morning, and that your handkerchief smells faintly of a tar. I observe that Mr. Ash's bicycle has not made it to town, and that the solicitor's name is a fragile thing to burn. I observe that your sugar jar is new, and your spoon very nearly is. Greta breathed once, shallowly, and then said in a tone so calm it might have been rehearsed, "Mrs. Linton is sleeping."
She must not be disturbed. Of course, said Miss Marple, and rose.
Sleep is a darling friend.
Only one should be quite certain it is sleep. Silence unrolled.
The church bell finished its thought and left the air thinner. Somewhere, a clock in the house struck the half-hour with polite certainty. A draught lifted the fringe of the mantle scarf and laid it down again, as if deciding to forget what it had learned. Miss Marple crossed to the hearth once more, set the ash curl and its petal gently onto the corner of the fender, and straightened the brush in its stand. Her hands were as steady as any seamstress's. "You see," she remarked, to no one in particular, "the trouble with ashes is that they keep secrets rather badly. They are easily smudged into telling the story one would prefer to leave untold." Greta's voice softened, almost pleading. "You are very quick, Miss Marple." "I have been slower in my time," Miss Marple said, quite pleasantly. "It was educational." The maid appeared again, hairpin askew.
"Ma'am, the doctor, should we—" "No," said Greta swiftly.
"No doctor?" Mrs. Linton asked expressly. "Did she?" Miss Marple inquired, the question delicate as lace. "Before she was resting deeply, or after?" Greta did not answer. Tom shifted. The maid swallowed. Miss Marple collected her gloves and parasol, and gave a little nod to the room, as one does when departing a place that has told one all it intends to for the moment. At the door she paused, as though remembering some trifling thing.
"Ah," she said softly, "I had quite forgotten. Mr. Ash's signet ring, did it not tap against the sideboard last night?"
Such a bright little sound.
"I wonder whether it left a mark." On the cloth, near the crimson ring, there was a hairline scratch, new and shallow. "Thank you," Miss Marple said to it, as if the scratch had spoken.
Then, to Greta, with kindness, "Do keep the room cool."
"Roses dislike heat, and so do nerves." She stepped out into the pale day.
The bicycle at the side gate looked thoughtful, as if it were reconsidering its profession.
On one tire, a smear of pondweed lay thin as paint.
Church bells resumed their gentle practice, and the sound seemed both consoling and stern. Down the path, a single crimson petal lifted, skated, and came to rest against Miss Marple's sensible shoe. She bent, picked it up with gloved fingers, and slipped it into the small envelope where the hearth fragment now lay. Two small things, both reluctant to burn, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the seventh shadow of tragedy, and that before the day grew older, the truth would ask to be spoken aloud. Morning came to St. Mary Mead with a stillness that felt almost deliberate,
as if the village itself were holding its breath.
The air was pale, washed clean of yesterday's tension, yet every bird seemed to sing half a note lower. In Miss Marple's cottage, the kettle whistled as cheerfully as ever, but the lady herself was not deceived by cheerful sounds. There is always a hush, she thought, before truth steps into a room that has grown tired of lies. At 10 o'clock, she took her shawl, her parasol, and a small envelope containing the fragment from the hearth and the unburned petal. She walked the lane toward Linton Hall with the same unhurried step she used for church bazaars and funerals, both of which in their way revealed character. The gate creaked softly. Even that seemed to expect her. Inside, the morning room was brighter than usual, sunlight pouring in as though it, too, meant to see clearly at last. Mrs. Linton sat by the window, fragile but conscious, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside her. Miss Greta Vale stood behind the chair, calm as ever, her hands resting lightly on its back. Mr. Lionel Ashe occupied the far corner, pretending interest in a silver photograph frame.
Tom Brixham lingered near the door, cap crushed in his fist. "Miss Marple!"
Mrs. Linton's voice was thin but grateful.
"I thought perhaps you would call."
"Things have been difficult," said Miss Marple gently. "Yes, my dear, they often are when the truth has been misplaced." No one moved. A clock ticked. Its pendulum sounded louder than polite society would approve. Miss Marple settled herself primly, smoothing her skirt as though she had come only for tea. "I do so hate confusion," she began, "particularly over such homely matters as spoons, ribbons, and documents. It seems to me that confusion thrives where tidiness has become too strict." Greta Vale's eyes narrowed, the faintest motion.
"If you mean to accuse not at all, my dear," Miss Marple said, smiling as kindly as any aunt at a naughty child.
"I mean to clarify. I have found that wickedness, like dust, settles most easily on polished surfaces." She placed the envelope on the table. "Inside you will find what your hearth could not quite consume, Mrs. Linton. A letterhead from Hargreaves and Bentham, and a petal. The same kind of petal that drifted into your sugar bowl at the fete, the same shade that glistened on Miss Vale's glove, and the same lacquer that marked your tea things." Mrs. Linton's fingers trembled. "A letterhead."
"But what could that possibly mean?" "That," said Miss Marple, "depends upon who placed it in the fire."
The Colonel's will, as I understand it, contained a small charitable bequest, one his widow might have felt rather less charitable about once she understood its size. But someone here thought to improve matters with a little codicil. The hand that traced it did so too neatly, beautifully in fact.
"A hand accustomed to practice, not impulse." Mr. Ashe gave a short, nervous laugh. "Surely you can't mean—" Miss Marple turned her mild gaze upon him.
"You, sir, are guilty only of opportunism and bad company. You valued the Colonel's belongings, found a buyer for a trinket or two, and hoped to relieve your own debts without unduly straining your conscience."
"No, it was not you who burned letters by morning light." Greta Vale's voice cut in, smooth but tight. "You speak as though you know everything." "Oh, not everything," said Miss Marple.
"Only enough. Enough to see that the red ribbon on last night's table was a signal, not a decoration. You tied one darker ribbon among the rest, to mark which napkin hid the altered spoon, the spoon whose bowl bore traces of lacquer and syrup. You rehearsed your measures carefully. I found your notes, pressed faintly into the blotter at the solicitor's office. Rose hip, 1 to 4, 4 to 8. It was a formula, my dear, not for dessert, but for dosage." Mrs. Linton stared, pale as paper.
"Greta, what is she saying?"
"She is mistaken," Greta said quickly. "Entirely mistaken?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Then you will be glad to explain why your glove bore polish identical to the brooch you mended, and why the sugar jar was replaced with one from your own room this morning."
"Oh, I looked, you see. Your maid, bless her, is not good at secrets."
"The syrup bottle beside your mirror was half empty, and your needle left crimson thread on the shelf." A stillness fell, complete and heavy. Mr. Ashe shifted, his eyes darting to the door, then back. Tom Brixham stood rooted, jaw clenched. Miss Marple went on softly. "It was never about jealousy or even love. It was arithmetic. You thought the codicil would grant you a lifetime annuity as Mrs. Linton's devoted companion, enough to free you from service without the vulgarity of dismissal. When Mrs. Linton hesitated to sign, you resolved to ensure the document's acceptance by other means. A gentle, natural decline, how easy to attribute it to nerves and strain." Greta's voice rose, sharp now.
"You've no proof?" "None. But I have evidence," Miss Marple said. "Tiny homely things."
The sugar spoon, lacquered to mask a trace. The ledger, falsified to give you an alibi during choir practice. The brooch, mended to hide the stitch that pricked your finger. There's the small spot of your own blood inside the clasp, I believe. It is the sort of mark truth leaves when it means to be found. Greta drew in a breath, then let it out slowly, and for the first time her composure cracked. Not shattered, merely cracked, like fine china that will never ring true again. I only meant she was going to cut me off.
After everything I'd done, Mrs. Linton whispered. Greta, my dear girl.
But Miss Marple, who had seen too many dear girls turn desperate, simply shook her head. You meant to save yourself, and instead you condemned yourself by being too tidy. Wickedness, you see, is a slovenly thing. It always leaves a mess somewhere. Mr. Ashe dropped his glass. It shattered, the sound oddly final.
I swear I only came for the valuation. I quite believe you, Miss Marple said kindly.
Your dishonesty was of the commercial sort, not the lethal. You will have some explaining to do about the ring mark on the sideboard, but nothing the law will fuss over. Tom Brixham stepped forward, face grim. Shall I fetch the constable, ma'am? Mrs. Linton covered her face. Greta Vale stood very straight, eyes dry, lips trembling only once before they steadied.
No need, she said softly.
I shan't trouble anyone further. Miss Marple looked at her with genuine sorrow. You are already troubling everyone, my dear. That's what deceit does. It keeps on troubling long after the truth is spoken. The gardener went to summon the constable. Mr. Ashe sat heavily, as if all the polish had gone out of him. Mrs. Linton wept quietly, the sounds small and bewildered. Miss Marple remained where she was, hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the sunlight shift across the carpet until it touched the crimson petal she had placed there. For a moment, the petal gleamed like a drop of blood. And then, as the light moved on, it dulled to ordinary red again. When the officers had come and gone, when the garden lay silent once more, Mrs. Linton turned to her visitor.
How did you know, Miss Marple? Oh, my dear, said Miss Marple, rising with a creak of honest joints. One knows the difference between roses that bloom from care and those that bloom from deceit.
Yours were too perfect, too forced. Beauty should breathe. It should never be managed. She laid a gentle hand on the widow's arm. Let your garden grow wild for a season. It will remind you that forgiveness, like roses, often returns uninvited. Outside, the afternoon sun burned away the last of the mist. The crimson roses, untended for days, had begun to fade at their edges, their colour softening into something almost human. Miss Marple paused by the gate, looked back once, and smiled, kindly, sadly, completely. The last bloom, she murmured, was never the prettiest, but it told the truest story. And with that, she walked home down the quiet lane, her parasol tapping gently against the gravel. As the village resumed its gossip in low, astonished tones, somewhere a kettle began to whistle again. Life, as it always does, was making tea, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew that the final shadow of tragedy had passed, and that, in the tender rustle of rose leaves, the village would remember this lesson for many seasons to come. The roses at Linton Hall faded quietly that week, their proud crimson softening to the colour of old silk. The constable's footsteps left no echo now, and gossip had folded itself into whispers told over teacups. Mrs. Linton, pale but peaceful, walked her garden again, letting the wind decide which blooms would stay. Miss Marple, back at her cottage, stirred her tea and smiled at the evening sky. She thought of ribbons, spoons, and the little lies people tell to make life gentler, and how those same lies, left unattended, can poison even sugar. Evil, she reflected, was rarely loud. It preferred clean handwriting and a steady hand. Beyond her window, the roses bowed to dusk, innocent once more. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew that truth, like a garden, must sometimes be pruned, but never forced to bloom before its time.